Ukraine keeps the pressure on Moscow. Drone attacks persist and billion-dollar losses are still accumulating. In the first days of 2026, Ukrainian drones began appearing over Moscow, with a frequency the city had never experienced before. This was not a symbolic gesture or a one-night shock. It was a sustained pressure campaign, forcing air defenses to activate again and again, pulling the war directly into the capital's airspace. Sirens, radar sweeps, and interceptor launches became routine. Moscow was no longer reacting to a distant conflict. It was defending itself nightly. Behind closed doors, Russian estimates began to circulate. By the end of the first week, the financial damage was already assessed at over $2 billion and climbing rapidly with each passing day. Those figures were not final. They were provisional, outdated almost as soon as they were calculated. This is the story of how that pressure began and why its cost continues to rise. At the start of 2026, the tempo of the war changed, and it changed decisively. Ukraine did not announce a new campaign. It simply began to strike Moscow again and again. What had once been sporadic symbolic UAV raids turned into near-daily pressure. Russian officials acknowledged a growing number of Ukrainian drones intercepted over the Moscow region in the opening days of the year. Nationwide, the scale was described as far higher, rising rapidly in a matter of days. These were not routine figures. They hinted at something much larger unfolding. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about a single dramatic night or a carefully timed political signal. Ukraine shifted from spectacle to frequency, forcing Moscow to respond every evening, every alert, every radar sweep. Air defenses stayed active. Crews stayed awake. Missiles were fired repeatedly to stop drones that cost a fraction of the interceptors launched against them. Moscow was no longer waiting for the next attack. It was living inside one. January 2nd, late night. The first Ukrainian UAVs approached Sanbay Vnukovo from the southwest, flying low and deliberately slow. This was not a mass swarm. It was a calculated entry designed to slip into civilian air corridors before being detected. When radar finally locked on, Moscow's air defenses reacted instantly. Interceptors launched. The sky above the airport flashed white as the first drones were destroyed. But the attack did not end there. Hours later, another group followed, slightly offset in direction and timing. Air defense crews had no chance to stand down. Sirens echoed again. Flights already on approach were forced to abort or divert. Ground operations slowed to a crawl. Vnukovo did not need to be hit to be neutralized. The threat alone was enough. January 3rd after midnight, the same pattern returned. New UAV contacts, new interceptions, missile after missile fired to stop drones that cost a fraction of the response. By now, it was clear this was not a test. It was pressure by repetition. Each engagement drained resources, strained crews, and deepened anger inside Moscow's command structure. By January 4th, the situation could no longer be downplayed. Air defense units around Vnukovo had been active across multiple nights. Civil aviation disruptions were mounting. The sense of control Moscow relied on was visibly eroding. That night, Bufang-Na issued its first consolidated acknowledgement. 57 Ukrainian UAVs had been intercepted over the Moscow region since the start of the year. Nationwide, the number had already reached nearly 440 drones. It was the first official snapshot of scale, and it would not be the last. Because as the calendar moved forward, the attacks did not slow. They pushed deeper, straight toward the defensive ring around Moscow itself. After the pressure on Vnukovo, the direction of attack shifted decisively inward toward the inner defensive ring of Moscow itself. January 5, 2026, shortly after midnight, Ukrainian UAVs approached from multiple vectors, staggered in timing and altitude. Some flew low to stretch radar coverage. Others followed minutes later, forcing operators to stay locked on their screens. Air defense units engaged repeatedly. Interceptors rose, detonating above the outskirts. The sky flashed, sirens echoed, then briefly silenced before the next contact appeared. By January 6th, the engagements had become routine. Batteries fired again and again through the night. Radar systems remained active without pause. Crews rotated under fatigue, knowing that standing down was not an option. Russian statements continued to speak of successful interceptions, but no updated total was released. The absence of numbers was itself revealing. By January 7th, the scale of the operation was clearly beyond the initial figures acknowledged days earlier. While no official update was issued, analysts tracking air defense activity and missile launches estimated that dozens more UAVs had been engaged around the capital since January 4th alone. The true count was almost certainly significantly higher than the last announced figures. The cost of this defense was no longer abstract. Each interception required surface-to-air missiles costing hundreds of thousands, sometimes over $1 million per shot. By conservative estimates, tens of millions of dollars in interceptor missiles may have been expended around Moscow in less than a week. Add to that the cost of continuous radar operation, emergency aviation measures, and non-stop personnel deployment, and the financial toll climbed even higher. This was the imbalance Ukraine was exploiting. Cheap replaceable UAVs forcing an expensive, irreplaceable defensive posture. The inner ring did not collapse, but it was forced to fight every night without relief. And by January 7th, the lack of updated official numbers suggested a deeper problem. The scale was still growing, and Moscow was not ready to quantify it publicly. Ukraine was no longer asking whether the shield could intercept. It was asking how long the shield could endure financially, mechanically, and humanly before the cost itself became the damage. By the second week of January, the impact of the attacks could no longer be measured by explosions or debris. The damage Moscow was absorbing was systemic, and it was mounting. Each night of interception carried a price. Conservative estimates suggest that tens of millions of dollars were spent on interceptor missiles around Moscow in less than a week. Some air defense interceptors cost hundreds of thousands per launch. Others approach seven figures, fired repeatedly night after night. They turned defense into a financial bleed. But missiles were only part of the bill. Radar networks ran continuously, pushing systems designed for intermittent use into sustained operation. Maintenance cycles shortened. Failure risks rose. Crews rotated under exhaustion, with extended shifts becoming the norm. The city's defensive posture shifted from readiness to attrition. Civil aviation absorbed its own shock. Repeated alerts forced temporary airspace restrictions, diversions, and ground holds. Even short disruptions multiplied across schedules, crews, fuel costs, and logistics. Airports didn't need to close permanently to suffer losses. Uncertainty was enough. Each alert added friction. Each delay compounded. The psychological toll followed close behind. Sirens became familiar. Flashes over the skyline were no longer rare. Residents adjusted routines to alerts they could not predict or ignore. The capital's sense of insulation, the idea that war happened elsewhere, began to erode. And still, the attacks continued. Ukraine's calculus was simple and ruthless. Cheap drones, expensive responses, replaceable UAVs forced irreplaceable strain on systems, budgets, and people. No single interception looked catastrophic. Together, they formed a pattern that was harder to absorb and harder to explain away. By now, officials avoided updated totals. Numbers lagged behind events. The absence of fresh figures spoke louder than confirmations ever could. It suggested not control, but containment of the narrative. This was the damage Ukraine was inflicting. Not ruins on the ground, but pressure that spread everywhere else across balance sheets, schedules, and nerves. And as Moscow paid this price nightly, one truth became unavoidable. A war of attrition does not require destruction. By the time the calendar moved past January 7th, the pattern was undeniable. This was no longer a series of attacks. It was a system grinding against another system night after night above Moscow. Ukraine's approach was brutally efficient. Low-cost UAVs were launched in repeated sequences, sometimes singly, sometimes in small clusters, always spaced to force maximum reaction. Each drone demanded attention. Each contact triggered tracking, confirmation, authorization, and more often than not, a missile launch. The math was unforgiving. A single interceptor can cost anywhere from hundreds of thousands to well over $1 million. A UAV costs a fraction of that. Multiply this exchange across multiple engagements per night, across several nights in a row, and the imbalance becomes staggering. Even conservative estimates point to tens of millions of dollars burned in interceptor launches alone within days. But attrition went beyond money. Missile stocks thinned, reload cycles accelerated, Air defense batteries designed for episodic use were forced into continuous combat readiness. Radar systems ran hot. Crews rotated without real recovery. Fatigue crept in, not dramatically, but steadily, the most dangerous way possible. This was the battlefield Ukraine had chosen. Not one decisive strike, but a rhythm Moscow could not interrupt. Every successful interception still counted as a defensive win. But each one also deepened the strain. The city's shield worked, yet it worked at a cost that accumulated invisibly, until it could no longer be ignored. Attrition does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly through shortages, delays, and mistakes. Ukraine did not need to overwhelm the defenses. It only needed to keep them firing. And the longer this exchange continued, the clearer the strategic trap became. Moscow could not stop responding. It could not afford to miss. Yet every response made the next night harder, not easier. Above the capital, the war settled into a cold equation. Cheap drones in the air, expensive missiles in response, and a defensive system being asked to do the impossible. Hold forever. In wars like this, victory does not come from breaking the shield in one blow. It comes from making the shield exhaust itself. By the end of the first week of January, the transformation was undeniable. Moscow was no longer a distant command center overseeing a war elsewhere. It had become part of the battlefield itself. For decades, the capital existed behind layers of assumption, distance, power, and control. War was something managed outward, absorbed by border regions and distant cities. That assumption collapsed as Ukrainian UAVs forced air defenses to fire above Moscow night after night. The shield held, but the illusion did not. By this point, Russian authorities had acknowledged only an initial portion of the engagements. No updated official totals were released after January 4th. Yet air defense activity told its own story. Independent estimates based on launch frequency, radar activity, and logistical strains suggested that the number of UAVs engaged around the capital had grown far beyond the first public figures. The real count by January 7th was almost certainly well into the dozens more, possibly higher. The cost followed the same trajectory, with interceptors ranging from hundreds of thousands to over $1 million each. Analysts assessed that the defensive effort around Moscow alone may have crossed the 50 to 70 million mark in a single week. And that figure did not include radar operations, emergency aviation measures, or the human cost of sustained high-alert duty. But the deeper damage was symbolic and strategic. Sirens over Moscow changed the meaning of the war. Air defense flashes over residential districts altered public perception. The capital was no longer insulated. It was exposed to the same uncertainty it had long imposed elsewhere. Each alert eroded the sense of permanence and control that power depends on. Ukraine understood this shift. It was not trying to seize territory or destroy landmarks. It was doing something subtler and more destabilizing, normalizing the idea that Moscow itself could be pressured. Not once, not dramatically, but repeatedly, predictably, relentlessly. This is how capitals lose their aura, not through collapse, but through repetition. As the days passed without new official numbers, the silence became louder than any announcement. It suggested hesitation and unwillingness to put a final figure on a problem that was still growing. In warfare, silence at the center often signals strain at the edges. Ukraine had achieved a strategic inversion. The city that once dictated the rhythm of the war was now reacting to it. Each night, Moscow waited for the next alert. Each morning, it assessed the cost of having defended itself again. The attacks did not end the war. They changed where the war was felt. And once a capital becomes accustomed to sirens, interceptions, and uncertainty, one reality sets in. There is no longer a true rear, only fronts moving closer than before. By early January 2026, the message was no longer subtle. Ukraine did not need to announce escalation. The sound of sirens over Moscow did it for them. What began as pressure became routine. What was once unthinkable became familiar. The attacks did not level buildings or redraw maps, but they redrew expectations. Moscow learned that distance no longer guaranteed safety and power, no longer ensured insulation. Every interception carried a cost. Every quiet morning followed a tense night. This was not about a single strike or a dramatic headline. It was about persistence, about forcing a capital to react again and again until defense itself became a burden. And that is the deeper shift this moment represents. When the war reaches the center, it changes how long a nation believes it can endure. Now the question is no longer whether Moscow can defend itself, but how long it can keep paying the price of doing so. What do you think happens next when pressure becomes routine? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to follow how this story continues to unfold, stay with us for the next chapter.